Hello, I'm Nick Holland with Information Security Media Group. I'm joined today by Beranek, who is VP at Nuance. I'm also joined by Jason Costain, who is Head of Fraud Strategy and Relationship Management at the Royal Bank of Scotland. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So you're here today, you're going to do a session talking about a case study. I always love case studies. It's good to have, a lot of times you talk about security, it's a little bit sort of abstract. But you're going to talk about the implementation of voice biometrics in a particular example that was deployed in the Royal Bank of Scotland. So first of all, let's start with that. So what can you tell me about the history behind that? Where did that start?
Well, I mean, we had a particular fraud problem that we were dealing with, which was large value payments were being made in branch banking. And when we started by fraudsters, and when we started to look at how the modus operandi worked for a fraudster, we actually traced things back to a fraudulent phone call. So at that point, our understanding of fraud in the telephony channel was that people would make fraudulent payments over the phone. But actually, what we realized was the telephony channel was being used for reconnaissance by fraudsters to cash out elsewhere. So that's when we started to think about how can we get better at detecting fraudulent phone calls.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. Again, I think I've always heard like the call center is always the weakest link, or it can be. It's very easy to defraud people because of, again, social engineering and so on and so forth. But tell us, where did the role of voice biometrics come into this? Maybe that's a good way for you to start into this.
Yeah, absolutely. So voice biometrics is a technology that maybe some of your readers and listeners may not be very familiar with. But it's like any other biometric technology, whether it's DNA fingerprinting or iris scanning. Our bodies are unique, and so are our voices. And in this context in particular, we're able to tap into a phone conversation and identify the human being that is actually speaking. And when it comes to fraudster detection, the job is to create a blacklist, so a list of known fraudsters, so that we can alert Jason and his colleagues when a fraudster is calling into his organization.
Okay. So, I mean, Jason, how big was the problem here? What are we talking about?
Well, I mean, for a start, if you go back to the root cause, the root cause is that data is being stolen on an industrial scale. And when your data's stolen, it remains in the hands of criminals. So, and as a bank, no stranger to ID and V being pins, passwords, and memorable names, and first line of your address, etc. So to identify people using static data, it is becoming weaker and weaker. So we know we need to move to a more effective means of IDing our customers. And we receive about 18 million calls a year. And within those calls, when we've used the voice biometric technology, we really started to get the full extent of the fraud traffic. So, just the example we found from using Fraud Miner is that around about, 1 in 3,500 calls is fraudulent. And the system itself created about 24,000 alerts a year. And it's been a pretty effective way of identifying fraud that wasn't just making payments, but it was actually identifying how fraudsters were using that particular channel.
I mean, that's kind of fascinating. I mean, you always think of voice biometrics as being something that's sort of kind of out there, but it's actually being used in commonplace applications like this.
Yeah, and it's really effective. So when you've got a fraudster's voice as a bank and you've got that recorded, that becomes a voice in your library. And when you get inbound calls coming in, you can start to match the inbound call to a small number of voices in the library. So that's that, and the technology is really effective. So if the system says there's a likely match, then there is a likely match. Yeah. And the investigators will listen to that call in real time, and they will then intervene in whatever activity the fraudster was actually trying to do.
So what about the false positive rate for something like voice biometrics? I mean, how accurate are we talking these days?
Yeah, so that's a question that I get very often, and there's two types of voice biometric matching that we do. One of them is a one-to-one match. That's when a legitimate customer calls in, makes an identity claim, and then we're matching if that specific voice matches to the voice print on file for that specific account. In those cases, we're in the 99.9% accuracy rates. Okay. So very accurate in that scenario. Jason, in his case, and in his fraud team, they're doing something a little bit different. They're doing a one-to-many. So they're getting millions of calls per year, and they're trying to match those to hundreds, if not more, fraudsters that they have on file. And there, maybe Jason can speak to the ratios of false alarms to correct alarms.
Yeah. So what are the lessons you learned from that then? I mean, really, what are the key takeaways from this particular exercise?
Well, I think one lesson is how effective the technology is.
Yeah.
So we're starting to use it in conjunction with other technology we have, like device profiling. So we start to build a better picture of how criminals are attacking us. And the other thing is just to actively manage the voice watch list, because if you keep on top of your fraud, you know who's calling you, and you actively manage the watch list, then you get a really fresh, I guess, database to search inbound calls against.
It's fascinating. And thanks very much for sharing the case study. It's really good to see technology being used to fight fraud at the sharp end there. Well, Brett, Jason, thanks for joining me today. So that's Brett Beranek and Jason Costain from Nuance Communications and Royal Bank of Scotland. And for Information Security Media Group, I'm Nick Holland.